Aloud.
All of us have good days and bad days. One thing that often makes me curious is why is it that sometimes I act in ways that I wish I didn't? I surprise myself. I might get triggered by someone that I love and lash out, or go into shame and guilt. In this episode today, we will better understand why that happens, why we get triggered, why we get reactive, and how to begin a process of healing those raw spots and reclaiming a sense of wholeness. You can't talk about triggering without understanding a concept called shadow. Shadow refers to the parts of ourselves that we no longer love, own, or take responsibility for. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." So do you find yourself dating the same type of person over and over? Do you find yourself in the same job time and again, even though you are at a different company, it's a different year, maybe you're even living in a different city? You got it. Basically, in these situations, we keep recreating the same patterns that are holding us back. Why does that happen? It's all related. You spot it, you got it. Sneak peek to the end is that you are allowed to love all parts of yourself. And getting triggered is one of the ways we can uncover what's there to love. Now let's begin the show.
Aloud.
When you were born, you were whole, perfect. Then somewhere along the way, you learned that parts of you were not allowed here, and you began to chip away at yourself. What are the pieces of you that you've put into the basement? The parts of you that we cannot see anymore or that you cannot even remember? What are the ways that you, without even knowing it, are eroding your own aliveness, your creativity, and your well-being? And how can you reclaim the wholeness that is your birthright? I'm Dr. Caneel Joyce, and I'm here to join you in exploring these questions and many more you didn't even know you were allowed to ask. You are allowed to grow. You're allowed to dream. You are allowed to be exactly who you are and to become the next version of who you want to be. Start your journey of exploration with me right now on Aloud.
Aloud.
You are allowed to be whole.
Thank you for being here today. Thank you for showing up for yourself. This is the beginning of the holiday season. We've got Thanksgiving coming up next week. It's a really important time to be grateful for yourself and for all of the things that are good in your life. Also, we know that Thanksgiving, holidays, family events, gatherings, parties, all of these things can bring some stress, sometimes even frustration or other intense negative emotions. Holidays are a great time to get triggered, and we can learn from getting triggered. Our guest today is Luke Entrup, executive coach and partner in evolution with me. We are so excited to have him here. He is a really good friend of mine. I've collaborated with him a ton. We love working together. We share a lot in common in our backgrounds from, growing up acting to design thinking to, the depth of work that we love to do together. And he's really one of the top experts in shadow. Anytime a book is written about shadow, almost always he gets contacted to be a reviewer on that book. So he's really, really one of the best. And it's a big honor to have him spending time here today. I'd like to share a bit about this concept of shadow. Luke will get more into this, but really briefly, the shadow is the part of ourselves that we don't own, we don't want to own, we deny that it's there, we might even repress it. Usually at some young age, we were taught that that part of ourself was not allowed, where we come into this world with this sparkling, completely unique, innocent, exuberant essence. And then we receive a message, and for whatever reason on that day from that person into our ear, we hear this message that we're not allowed. We shadow those parts of ourselves. We try to show up in the world for a long time as if those parts do not exist and that we're somebody else. And eventually it breaks. That plan does not work. And we begin the process of adulting, where we fetch that lost child and we parent it and we bring it back and we love it and we integrate it into who we are. And as an executive coach, in my work with founders and CEOs, I find When we can identify and reclaim our shadow, that's where we find our brightest gifts. So, why are we talking about shadows so much on an episode about how to stop getting triggered? Triggers and shadows are deeply interconnected. A trigger is basically when I get really, really reactive, and all of us can understand this. We have an outsized reaction to something. Someone pushes our buttons, something pushes our buttons, and we are immediately bothered. We are, activated, and we might even surprise ourselves by lashing out or going quickly into a shame or guilt or blame cycle, and feeling a little bit out of control, but yet it's so, so familiar. So I'm sure everyone can relate to this experience of being triggered. And right now in this moment, I just want you to identify, what's something that has triggered you recently? What's the last time that something just pushed your button and before you knew it, you were in a really different, heated emotional state? Usually anger, sometimes shame, blame, guilt. Okay, you've got an example? It could be anything. It could be getting stuck in traffic, someone cuts you off. It could be that there's crumbs on the countertop when you get home from work. It could be, I remember I used to work with somebody, and if there was only one space after a period, he would just hit the ceiling, so angry. So for him, that was a trigger. It really can be anything, and often it is something kind of mundane. And especially it's often something that somebody else does or a quirk of something. So, these are your pet peeves, right? So find that thing and think about how you react. And now I'm going to share the secret. So when we're triggered, you don't want to know why that happens? Usually it's because we just saw our own shadow. We saw out there in the world or in somebody else that part of ourself that we don't want to own, we don't want to claim, we don't want to talk about, we don't want to feel or experience, and we certainly don't want it to be seen. And when we see that part of ourself out there, we freak out. We get triggered. Our ego reacts and fights against it, trying to really keep us from waking up to, oh, there's this part of myself I left in the basement. I haven't yet pulled it out and loved it yet. We're in denial. So this often is a little bit of a hard pill to swallow because we don't want to believe, of course, that these things that bother us so much in others are true of ourselves. So I want to give you a couple of examples. So one might be, I hear this often from clients is, it's really hard to manage these millennials. They are, they want to be CEO yesterday. They are always wanting a lot of praise. They're very entitled. We've all read these kind of stereotypes about the millennial generation, which is an incredible generation, by the way. When we hear those things, it's the useful question is not how do you manage other people's sense of entitlement? It's how are you being entitled? How are you not owning that you too want appreciation, that you too want to be promoted? So, what might you be entitled to? Well, for instance, you might be entitled to the idea that people who report up to you don't constantly ask for appreciation. Simple as that. Or that people who report up to you are happy to stay in that position and they're not trying to move ahead, that sense of entitlement. So here's how the cycle goes. Early in life, you shadow something about yourself. You deny that it's there. Later on, you see that part of yourself in someone else, unconsciously recognizing it as your shadow. Deep in denial, your ego lashes out. You're triggered. You blame them. The magic move here is turning that finger of blame that you're pointing at them around and pointing it at yourself and say, how is that true of me? But doing it not from a place of blame, but one of creative curiosity. Like, I want you to get hungry about, ooh, cool, I just got triggered. There must be something for me here, something for me to learn. Let me check this out and see how that's actually just as true of me as it is of them. And in fact, it might be completely a projection on them. It might be only true of you, but you're just seeing it everywhere. You hear a lot like, why is everybody like XYZ? So that patterned ways of perceiving the world is a really good indication that we're triggered. So this is the connection between triggering and shadow. And as you might imagine, Some of our favorite people to get triggered by tend to be those closest to us, our loved ones and our families. And in our family, that's often where we also decided to shadow parts of ourselves. It's nobody's fault. It's completely human. There's nothing more normal than this process. And it's a gift. It's a gift to get to wake up and see what else is there of me to love, reclaim it, own it, and become more whole. So I'm so excited to have Luke Entrup, executive coach and partner in evolution, here on the show with me. Great friend, a really wise person, incredible human being. Let's dive in and see what we can learn from Luke about shadow.
Allowed.
Today, my guest is my amazing friend and partner and collaborator, Luke Entrup. Hi, Luke.
Hey, Caneel.
Hey, you.
So good to be here.
Oh, man, always so good to be with you.
I love the new studio. This is exciting.
Thank you. Familiar territory for you, huh?
Yes, indeed. Indeed. Yeah. Not my first time in a studio, but first time in a studio with such a stellar view of the ocean.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. I feel very fortunate about this whole setup here. I glued these sound panels on. My kids helped me put them together over the weekend, and we stuck them up there when we were building this studio. So you and I have something in common. We have many things in common. We have in common that we both are former startup executives and operators.
Mm-hmm.
We are coaches. We love to have a great time and laugh. We love design thinking. We're actually doing some design thinking training videos later on today after we do this podcast. And we both grew up on the stage as child actors.
Indeed, we did. Yes.
Somehow I think we knew this about each other without even ever knowing it, because there was this instant recognition, I think, that your one is going to be really fun to play with.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. We have a good time.
Child actors spot each other
yeah,
in the crowd.
Somehow we know. So how in the world did you end up doing what you're doing now, given that you began your life thinking you were going to have a really different path as an actor?
So, yeah, I grew up loving being an actor. And then at some point that dream kind of shifted for me. It just wasn't there. Didn't feel like the thing to do anymore when I was in my early 20s. I had a period of like a dark night of the soul where I was kind of spinning my wheels a bit in my late teens, early 20s, and traveled a bit and worked and was kind of in and out of college. And at an early age, I found myself in men's work. So personal development work for men. And something in me really shifted around this. I got connected with some just amazing mentors, elders, older men who were very formative for me in my early 20s around what it means to live, with a sense of purpose and mission and integrity. And so I spent much of my 20s doing that type of work and leading retreats myself and kind of transformational personal growth retreats through much of my 20s, coaching and doing some organizational work around young talent. And then at some point I decided I was done helping other people build their dreams. I wanted to go out in the world and do something myself, right?
Dirty.
Exactly. wanted to build something myself. So I went back to graduate school, got a couple of master's degrees, and essentially worked in health innovation for several years in running health clinics and working in health tech and healthcare innovation. And
another thing we have in common.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So really bringing some of the design thinking into the healthcare space. And then with a wonderful organization, by the way, Center for Care Innovations, I did a lot of my training with them. And over the last, 8 years or so, I this call to really help people become better versions of themselves and to hold them through some of their most critical transitions in their life and helping kind of shape their dreams really just never died in me. And it's really, it is kind of my deepest calling is to hold people through radical transformation. And so this is kind of the return back to coaching for me. And that's how we've worked together. So these several years now. So. Yeah.
Well, I'm so grateful that you made the turn back.
Yeah.
And interestingly, I also dropped out of acting around in my early 20s. But I feel I'll never stop acting. I'll never stop being an actor, and have that background I feel is so valuable for so many things. And I know I certainly use it just from the standpoint of understanding how to get into embodied empathy, emotional empathy with a client in an experience that I've personally never had, but being able to kind of feel in my body, what's it like to be there?
I know you want to talk about shadow today, right?
Yeah.
So what better way to understand shadow than to be able to step into roles, parts of
Yes.
ourselves or an actual role of a character, but to actually fully become it and embody it.
Mhm.
That actually is one of the cornerstones around kind of this idea of emotional integration and kind of reclaiming lost parts of ourselves. So there is a thread between that of like becoming fully some part, some aspect of ourselves through a character, through an archetype, through an emotion. It's a really important ability to cultivate in ourselves if we want to be a fully embodied leader.
Yeah. And shadow work is not child's play. It's you're getting into some of the darkest corners at times. And these are the parts that can be really, really reactive from the self. This is where the ego really tries to defend itself and resist. And getting into working deeply with someone's shadow and really being able to hold them, as I've seen you do in ways that I have just floored and stunned me. And I cannot believe the way you hold space for people in the most dramatic situations. And I know, I just want our listeners to know this is kind of heavy duty stuff. And working with someone as skilled as Luke or someone else who's been really well trained is super, super important. Luke, what are some of the qualifications that you have in particular around shadow, and what are some things our listeners could look for?
Sure, yeah. I was blessed when I was in my early 20s to be able to be mentored by a guy named Cliff Berry, who started a training company or organization called Shadowwork Seminars, and it's really it was one of the very early disciplines around this, borrowing from this lineage of Jungian psychology and psychodrama and other places. But Cliff Berry is one of the kind of original folks that really developed this way of working with people. So I was blessed to be certified in Shadowwork Seminars when I was in my mid-20s. I went to Naropa University, which is a Buddhist-inspired university that and got a degree in contemplative psychology, which is essentially the meeting of the contemplative practices of the East with Western psychology. So,
so cool.
Yeah, I mean, I would have classes in Buddhist meditation, Tibetan Buddhist meditation, and then I go into a class around personality theories. It's a really wonderful training ground around not just the theoretics, but the kind of embodied experiential components of what it means to be kind of a transformational leader. And then I did my graduate studies at Tulane and did a master's in social work and master's in public health and kind of, kind of that kind of classic training around psychotherapy. And
dang boy, you know a lot of stuff. Oh my gosh,
way too many hours in a university.
Your shadow work training, I seem to remember that you need to go back every single year to get recertified.
Yeah, it's every 2 years, but I go back every year at this point, and the certification is brilliant. It's very simple. You have to facilitate someone doing their work, and you have to do your own work. Wow. And that is the certification, because one of the cornerstones around of holding people in some of these most tender, vulnerable places is that you have to be able to have done your own work and know how it moves through your system, and to make sure that you're constantly looking at your own shadow.
So, Luke, what is shadow?
Yeah, so shadow comes from a Swiss psychiatrist. This term, Carl Jung, coined the term, and it's really just the parts of ourselves that we repress, deny, hide. So it's parts of ourselves we push away, that we don't want to feel and or experience or express. And
what's an example of that?
There's many. So one way we think about this, I think Robert Bly, the poet, talks about this as being born as 360 degrees of light, pure potential. If we've ever looked into an infant's eyes, you know that there's like nothing but possibility there, right? And over time, things happen to us. People tell us to be a certain way or not a certain way. We're encouraged to not behave or express certain parts of ourselves, and those little bits of light start to get hacked away, and that full expression becomes a little diminished. So some examples of this, maybe as a young child, we were told things like, the art stuff, that's for girls, that's not for boys. Or we may hear something like, you're so ugly when you cry. And these messages start to, yes, right? Yeah. So
for mine, it was, you're so dramatic. That one hurt for a long time. And then I'm like, wait, you're right. I am so dramatic.
Great. So you flipped it. That's the Aikido of shadow work. Where once we start to own it, then it just, we get all that energy back from it. Yeah. So as we move through our lives, these messages that we took on as children shape a lot of how we show up. And this is really important as leaders, that we're tracking these subtle messages, because we can leave quite awake in an organization if we're not tracking our shadow.
Have you seen a situation like that where someone's shadow was leaving a bite
Sure,
mark?
absolutely. Yeah. I worked with several clients around this particular dynamic that I think we see a lot in startups, which is the shadow. It occurs as a behavior that others see as being like a very hard driver, like just working very long hours and driving their teams really hard, and the people around them feel very burnt out and pushing so hard. And when thinking about what is beneath the drive, oftentimes there's some smaller part of ourselves that believes that we'll only be validated or seen or acknowledged by what we do in the world, not who we are. And this is certainly one that I have, right? And so that's the belief there is like I'm probably worthless unless I can create enough success in the world, or enough financial security, or enough buffer from the judgment of others. And so these are some pretty deep-seated messages that can drive a lot of behaviors that aren't always helpful. So we see this a lot with hard driving founders that are burning out their teams or burning out themselves, where they are growing resentful towards their business or their company. And often, if we can trace it back and actually shift that message a bit, then they can have a different relationship to that driving part.
When I think of who's impacted by my shadow most, it's definitely my family. Thanksgiving is right around the corner here. And each year I notice, of course, my own growth, the growth of people in my family. And then I also notice I go back to being a 2-year-old, an 8-year-old, a 16-year-old, a 22, all of those parts of me show up. And I think it's the family, when you're with your family of origin, like many of us will be at Thanksgiving, or even with our chosen family of friends. If you're doing a Friendsgiving, like I used to do when I lived in London abroad, there are opportunities when we're with those that we really love to get really triggered. And I understand that there's a very specific connection between getting triggered and our shadow. And I'd love you to talk a bit about that, because all of us have this big opportunity coming up at Thanksgiving to really start diving in and doing some work on this. So what's the connection between triggering and shadow?
Yeah, it's this is maybe one of the more important questions, right? Like, because obviously what happens is we go back into the dynamics, the messages, the environment, the actual characters, that are caused some of these shadows, or helped form some of these shadows. And so they become incredibly amplified. If you think that you don't have any shadows, just go home for Thanksgiving for a week and just notice how you feel about yourself halfway through that.
So it's human. It's a human experience.
Yeah.
Very normal.
Absolutely. But it's also a wonderful opportunity for those of us that are interested in continuing to eat these shadows, as we say, or continue to integrate these lost parts of ourselves, to go back and see where we're at. What's our next phase of work that we need to do? So if we treat Thanksgiving as an opportunity to do some reconnaissance on the next layer of soul work, the next layer of parts of ourselves that may still be disowned, then it's a very valuable experience. And again, this is obviously where the contemplative practices and finding some stillness in the midst of the insanity can be really, really important. There's some other ways that we can discover our shadows as well. And triggering is the mechanism, right? Where are we getting lit up? It could be in our family. There's this concept that we work with a lot in our work around projection. So it may be in our organization, in our workplace, or just in the world. We bump up against people that really rub us wrong, that have us feeling angry, or feeling repulsed, or feeling
just instantly set off.
Yeah. So this is a clue. This is the idea of projection, where we're projecting onto those around us some part of ourself that we don't want to see, or some dynamic that's probably rooted in our past.
No, it's them. They're wrong.
They're wrong.
It's their
right?
fault.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, so it's the what is it? The 5-finger point. So if I see it in you, and I'm pointing at you, there's 3 fingers pointing back at me, and there's 1 pointing straight up. And so it's that, if you spot it, you got it. If something over there is really, really bothering you and you go instantly into reactive mode, most likely it's something true of you that you haven't yet owned.
That's right. And so it's a wonderful clue. I mean, when we get lit up by someone or triggered or set off, it's a wonderful opportunity for us to learn about some part of ourselves that we're not fully integrated.
Mm-hmm.
And as you get a little more sophisticated in this, in working with these projections, the next step around this is knowing that whose face is that on this person that just cut me off, or the person that I believe has wronged me, or that I feel like I've hurt in some way. I'm going into my own shame. Like, whose face is that? Is that my father's?
Mm-hmm.
Is that my little sister's? Is that whose face am I putting on top of that? And how long ago was that? And then we can start to actually, release some of the energy that's wrapped up in the dynamic. There's one other way, which you and I work with a lot in our leadership clients, which is just ask people, like, what are my shadows? And, we do 360 reviews, or like the classic way of doing this in an organization, a really powerful, very effective mechanism at surfacing one's shadows.
For those who don't know, can you explain what a 360 review is?
Sure. Yeah. So in organizations where we spend most of our waking hours, we are constantly bumping up against people that we're working with, and they probably understand, other than maybe our intimate partners and our family, understand our shadows better than anyone else. And so we'll go in as coaches and interview or survey the 10 or 15 closest collaborators in a leader's network and ask them point blank, like, what are her blind spots? What are his blind spots? What are his strengths and gifts? Like, when he's at his best, how does he show up? What are some of her biggest ways that she leaves awake or trips herself up or gets in her own way? And what are some of the challenges that she's facing? And then we'll do a big, and it's always anonymized, right? So like, people can speak freely, and we'll synthesize that and give it back in a report, but more importantly, in some sessions to help them digest and to do some of the coaching sessions to help them digest and make sense and really figure out how to respond.
For many human beings, receiving feedback is scary. And when we are scared and we are alone, it can be really difficult to learn. Debriefing on feedback in a setting with a person who's going to slow it down enough that you can actually dwell and spend some time in a safe, supported, loved way on the things where there's the most learning for you is just essential for onboarding any feedback. And you can do that with a coach. And I think it's the skill set there is hugely valuable. That our training, our credentials, our professional ethic is really, really extremely important. But also, you can create conscious relationships where you can receive feedback and have somebody else walk you through this kind of feedback. Most people can kind of predict what's going to set you off in a workplace. And that's a really good starting map of what about me might I still not love. We're allowed to see those parts, and we're allowed to share those parts. We're allowed to heal those parts. We are allowed to love those parts. Like, there's no part of ourself that's unlovable. And I find that really so many of our deepest, deepest gifts are in our shadows. Like, they're the parts that we've pushed down into the basement. And I love that process of just slowly giving someone the space to open up enough to like walk a couple steps down into that basement and find those unclaimed parts, and then look at them in the light and see like what jewels are there, just dust them off and figure out where they're going to go in your life in a conscious way. So they're not growing mold or creating problems. It is really, really important work. And last Christmas, speaking of Thanksgiving coming up around the corner, I decided last Christmas I was going to take all of December and not drink any alcohol, specifically because I wanted to go through all of the holidays like fully conscious and just greet whatever learnings come my way. And just, total disclaimer here, I have like a really wonderful family that gets along super, super well, and we all really, really love each other. And there's just no family in which shadow dynamics do not exist. They're alive and well at my house, but it's all opportunity.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's the best opportunity to see where we are in relation to freeing ourselves of the past.
This sounds a little bit extreme. So, believing that you're worthless or without value, is this something that would kind of, you'd see in a child that comes out of a really abusive home, or perhaps lost both their parents, or, is this an extreme case, or is this actually pretty normal?
Yeah, I think it certainly happens in the extreme cases, right? Trauma has a very pervasive way of shaping beliefs about oneself. But it really, I mean, my belief is that we all have shadows. We all were formed in a certain way. That's just the nature of being human, is that we're going to inevitably bump up against hurts and pains and disappointments and betrayals. That's just part of the human condition. And so, and we'll take on beliefs about ourselves based in these experiences. So whether we were explicitly told these messages of being, you're worthless, some people hear that, right? Other people, the behaviors of those around them, they weren't explicit messages, but there were implicit messages through the type of love they got, conditional love, or the certain ways they were shaped subtly. So whether we heard the messages very clearly or whether we inferred them, it doesn't matter. What really matters is the message that lives within our own heart and soul.
I can imagine that. Just being a parent of two, is Luke and I, we have kids basically the same age, and lots of similar personality quirks in our kids, which is fun. But I know that I'm role modeling for them things that come from my own shadow, and that I haven't yet reconciled. And this was a pretty depressing thought to me for a while, that even though I've done so much personal work and so much therapy and so many retreats, and that still I'm going to mess them up. And sharing this with my therapist one day, and she gave me a book, and it's called I'll Never Do What My Parents Did to Me. I haven't read the whole book, but the point is basically, yes, you will. But hopefully less.
Yeah.
Hopefully less.
Exactly. And this is, I mean, in some ways, this is the very definition of a shadow, is like we tell ourselves we will never be a certain way or never do a certain thing, yet we find ourselves doing it anyway.
Even if you do the opposite thing, it creates the same response.
Yeah. And so what's the path through, right? So the path through, and this is where we get into some of the shadow work, is I mean, we can spend our whole lives pushing away, trying not to be a certain way, trying not to be seen a certain way, or show up as a jerk, or show up as in the same way that our parents did. And we find ourselves doing it anyway. So what's the way through is by actually allowing ourselves to find a place, a space, a container to express that ourselves in a way where there's not real life consequences. So whether that's with a coach, whether that's on a retreat, whether that's with a therapist, allow ourselves to go into the part of ourselves that could just completely destroy those around us, and actually feel what's beneath that, or our own self-loathing or self-hatred, finding places that are safe enough for us to really feel the bottom of those feelings. And it's oftentimes a long process. And but once we get through that, then it frees up all this energy that we've been storing in not being a certain way. And that's really fundamentally, that's what shadow work is embodying, experiencing, expressing those parts of ourselves that are either taboo to the culture, or we have some sort of mental block or message or blind spot around not wanting to be a certain way.
This reminds me of something I do with I have a year-long leadership forum. It's focused on conscious leadership, and a lot of the practices we do, I picked up from the Conscious Leadership group, and they've got some fantastic resources to offer that I'll post them in the show notes. But one of the things that we do in conscious leadership is we do persona parties. And we find some persona that drives us some of the time, and often we've got a lot of personas within us, different elements of our personality that often are at odds with each other, and get into little arguments. And they're always fighting for who gets to be in control, or who gets to drive the bus right now. So we pick one of those. I bring bins and bins full of costumes, and I lay them out. We do this in the middle of our program on a 3-day retreat. I lay them out all over the living room of our rented home, and then people go in. They find costumes that speak to one of their particular personas. And the second they put them on and they come out of that room, they're in persona for the rest of the night. They're not allowed to break character. So they act like them, they talk like them, and then we go out into the world. Last year we did it in Malibu, and we went to a restaurant. We ordered food. We were over the top. It's hilarious. It's super interesting. And you learn so much about, if I only let this part drive, here are the costs. But you also learn, wow, there's a lot of benefits to this part of me too. So for some examples, one of my clients has this part of herself that's very controlling and wants to just control outcomes and control other people and make sure that everything's perfect. She's an Enneagram type 3. And she got to play that role full on this time. And coincidentally, her mother happened to call while she was in persona, and she found that how she was going to interact with her mother naturally was that persona. And then she just got to do it bigger, and she learned so much. And that year I played a shy person because I really love to pretend I'm not shy. That was not something, especially like acting growing up, that was not something that I valued. I didn't feel safe to be shy. I didn't have a lot of support around how to navigate it. But on the inside of me, there is a very, very shy person. And it was such a relief to just get to go out and play small. Like, I loved it.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much energy that can be freed up when we allow ourselves to step into these parts that we push away, right? That's so much information can happen can be delivered to us. And there's a lot of different ways to do it. I mean, you're talking about like, we do these things called shadow dances, which is very similar, where it'll be, for a couple of hours or a lot of different costumes, and you can go be Elvis or kind of the Santa Claus, whatever it is, just like whatever that part of you that you've always wanted to experience. Some of them a little more manipulative or a little creepier, to actually allow yourself in a place where there's not going to be any real life consequences to kind of move those energies through. So that's one way. The other way is to there's certain methods that you can actually step into parts of yourself, like a sub-personality that is maybe one that you're not always fully tracking and but is making a lot of decisions for you. So the part of you that's constantly surveying risk, right? Like, what if you could fully become your risk manager? The part of you that is tracking risks in your relationships, in your business, in your life, and completely step into that part for maybe 10 or 15 minutes and let it fully give its expression of how you've set up your life in a dangerous way, how your business is going to fail, and
all of that paranoid thinking, contingency planning, and that all gets to happen that night.
It happens in any sort of these. I do this often with my coaching clients, where you just allow each person to step into their risk manager completely, or the part of themselves that is we might call it like the higher self, the part that sees through all the tricks that are being played and the confusion, and can just look at your life from kind of a higher place, in a more noble or sovereign place, or the part of you that wants nothing more than to be connected by those around you, a place of emotions and kind of that lover energy and certain qualities that we all kind of carry, putting people in these specific parts of themselves and then allowing them to look at the situation in front of them. That's another way that shadow work can work.
Fascinating. So you do this with all kinds of clients, executives, CEOs, founders. And what are some of the results that they notice or that their organizations feel?
I would say this type of work I do with most of my clients at some point, right? There's a lot of different ways to work with people in a coaching setting. Sometimes we just need to give them some skills or a framework or some models or help them run a meeting. Shadow work is a rather specific tool for specific dynamics. So persistently painful patterns that we've tried a lot of other things and nothing's shifting. Things that are a bit deeper in the inner workings of an individual that are causing misalignment or harm in their life or those around them. And so this fundamentally is about shifting our beliefs about who we are in the world. And so it takes a little bit more space. It takes a little bit more time and the results. So I alluded to this dynamic that I see often, which is the kind of the hard driving co-founder, right? Or founder or CEO, that often when we get underneath that, there's usually some smaller part of them that is feeling vulnerable or needing to be protected. And when we can shift that, then often it allows them to relax and redesign how they're in their role. Maybe they actually don't need to work 16 hours a day. They can start to bring in a team to help and start trusting other people. Or maybe they realize that not everybody needs to push at the same level as them, and they need to create a slightly different culture in their team. I'd say that's one of the most common ways that I use this kind of way of working with people. So.
Wow, that must really transform what it's like to be in those organizations.
I think so. I hope so. I think this is back to we can we can work at a few different levels. We can focus just on changing behaviors. And sometimes that's what is needed. We need to give people a new kind of methodology or new operating agreements amongst themselves. But I believe the deeper work actually comes by shifting our beliefs about who we are and our beliefs about the nature of the world around us. And that's fundamentally what shadow work is. It's actually shifting our core beliefs about our place in the world and how we relate to others. And that's, that it's a rather unique way to do it.
So we've talked about the importance of being as a leader and not just doing, and the shifts at the B level have so much more leverage, and the ability to have change happen more easily once you've made that B level shift. It has exponentially more potential than any one change in behavior. I think it's not as easy to do, and it certainly requires a lot of support. So
yeah, and I'm sure you've experienced this. I mean, for me, some of the deepest changes I've had in my life have been around beliefs I have about myself. As you mentioned, like I came up as a child actor, got a lot of like external validation for who I was, and in that process, kind of became really necessary to get a lot of applause. And at an early age, that's how I formed my sense of self. And so as life happens and things change and hopes and dreams change and things come and go, those messages still live within me. And I found over time, the more I can shift those beliefs of like needing external validation and really become quiet in my own heart and soul and change those beliefs around what actually feels best for me, not what is best for those around me. It's dramatically changed my existence. Right. And that's, I mean, for me, that's just about going into those kind of hurt places and all those places where we get formed early on and shifting those beliefs. So.
I relate so much to what you're sharing. And, for me, acting, I think it made it that my default mode of operating was performing. Like that there's this, I need to get up and perform and be a certain way, for others as my interface to protect myself, to protect just the vulnerability of, I don't know what's going to happen next, which is when I'm more in presence, right? And I'm not trying to control. Relaxing out of that performing mode has been something that's taken me, my whole life. And I'm really still working at it a lot. But I also love performing. So how do you reconcile that? I mean, it's certainly part of my shadow, but I feel it's also part of my gift.
Absolutely. And this is where we get, when we actually start really living our life through this lens of anything that feels a little unexpressed, I'm going to actually lean into it and maybe even make some art out of it, make some sort of creative expression about my need to be seen or my need to be validated or my, that darker part of me that could just like take advantage of people around me. Like I actually can, in love, create some sort of expression of that. It actually shifts our whole reality where there is less of a push-pull and less of this pushing things into our shadows and behind us, where we become just much more alive in the moment and can express these things, these what used to be our hurts and our kind of things we didn't want to show to other people. We can be playful with it. And you and I, we've had a lot of fun. A lot of fun of just like owning the part of ourselves that just either needs to be seen or needs to whatever, be perfect or feel so.
Or like it's just never
terminally,
enough.
Terminally
enough.
Unique and that no one ever gets me. I know you know nothing about this.
We play a lot with that one. Yeah, so I'm for those who don't know the Enneagram is an amazing personality system. It's very ancient. It's complex and nuanced and beautiful, and is based on the idea that there are archetypes that show up in the human experience, and that each of us has one of these archetypes that's our core archetype. We all have all of the archetypes within us, and there are strengths and weaknesses to each of them. And so if you want to learn, I will link to some resources about this in the show notes. But, at Evolution, we work a lot with shadow and a lot with the Enneagram, and they're deeply, deeply connected. So, Luke is a type 3, like my husband. That's the achiever type. And I am a type 4, which is the individualist, which is kind of the tragic artist type. And so I get made fun of a lot. And I make fun of myself a lot within the evolution context, because type 4s have this. Oh, and also, we know a lot of type 4s. within the type 4, there's this core belief that something is missing. There's something that's not here, that never will be here, and I'll never be able to get it, but I really, really want it. And it's basically envy, right? It's this envy of some other ideal possible reality. So when he says there's something missing, there's always something missing. It's not enough. I'll never have what I want. That's kind of, yeah, these are my previously shadowed experiences that now are out in the open, and it's just fun. It's like, oh yeah, of course there's always something missing, but I'm really good at finding what's missing. And Luke, what's yours? What's your kind of core Enneagram?
My core is that I will project an image of success, even though underneath that I feel deeply insecure and can get a bit plastic, basically, like project out what I want people to think that I am experiencing or giving. And so often people actually experience me as sometimes a bit arrogant or aloof or a little disconnected because I put up a facade. And so to play around with this, I often will just go super, like, this is the Elvis, like the just total strange, disconnected projection of what I want you to think I am, rock star, or like, but underneath all of that often is feeling very needy and but never wanting to show my neediness. So the other side of this is like just playing around with neediness. And that's always fun. And I'd say, there's one other thing about shadow I think it's important to mention, which is for us to really understand in a meaningful way what our personal shadows are. It requires us to have the ability to get quiet and to really find a place of stillness in our own being so that some of these deeper messages become clear. And so for me, this is also just where the importance of contemplative practices, meditation, yoga, for me, martial arts, where I can still down my mind enough to unravel some of these more pervasive, darker things that I don't want others to know about me. And I think this is where contemplative practices are really critical. We can't just do shadow work. We also need to tap into something that's connects us to a deeper place of stillness. In the same way that we can't just meditate to find a way towards personal development, we also need to do emotional integration work. We need to be able to work with our bodies. So I think for me, these are two fundamental pillars in leadership and in personal development: contemplative practices and emotional integration work, or shadow work.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. There's not one silver bullet approach to becoming a better human, essentially. That we really need to mix them all together.
Yeah, it's taking kind of an integral view of different. We have different lines and stages of development, and we need to work across all of them. If we just sit in a cave our entire life, then we won't actually be relating with others. We may reach some level of enlightenment, but it'll be in a very specific way. It won't be of the world. And in the same way that if we just look at healing our past and expressing these unexpressed things, there will be a lack of depth in our being. And so we need to be able to also go to the quiet places so that we can bring both the depth and the connection.
Thank you. That's beautiful. So for those listeners out there, I'm imagining some of them are wondering, what could I do now to begin to understand what my shadow looks like? What are some things that we can do in our daily lives? Yeah,
there's a great exercise that I've used many times. I did this myself for years and share this with clients often, but one of the gateways into our shadows are through our core emotions. And I like to, there's a model we use, which is 5 core emotions. So mad, sad, glad, afraid, and shame. So anger, grief, fear, joy, and shame. Shame being different than guilt. Shame being how we feel bad about ourselves, not about what we've done, but about who we are. And there's a way in which we can journal from each of these 5 emotions. In some cases, you can use your non-dominant hand, or you simply just write as if you're fully in each of these 5 emotions. And the way you do this is you set up a space, like a physical room, and you would imagine the room is your life, and you would physically move in the room where you believe your anger lives or your
Mm.
sadness lives or your fear, and you go fully into it just
Mm.
for 2 or 3 moments and journal. Just allow it to move through you. So as part of this exercise, you can actually move, the invitation is to actually move into the location in the room. If the room was your life, that you move to a location in the room that perhaps your anger lives, or your fear, or your shame. And you can even allow your body to take that shape a bit. Spend a few moments breathing in to actually stoke the feeling. And then from there, journal briefly for a few moments from the place of your anger. And asking questions like, how long have you been here? What do you believe about Luke or Caneel or yourself?
So you're asking the fear, you're asking the anger, these questions, and then you're listening for the answers and writing them down.
That's
as
right.
They come.
And you actually want to move completely into it just for a few moments, knowing that you'll come back to yourself at the end, but allow yourself to fully feel your grief or your shame or your joy, letting all these other parts of ourselves fall away and becoming that part completely. And then tracing it back, being curious about its origin, what its messages are, how does it serve you? How does it not serve you? How does it get in the way? And so this is just using the emotions as the gateway. And we can amplify this by actually using our bodies to amplify it. So the body's kind of like an antenna for these emotions and for these shadows. So if we're in shame, maybe we actually allow our shoulders to roll forward and take on the posture of shame, and then allow the message to flow through the pen.
Wow, it's powerful. We'll describe this for our listeners in the show notes. It sounds like a great exercise that you can guide yourself through. A lot of times on this show, I'll talk about 5 basic emotions as well. And I didn't realize that shame was one of them. For me, the 5th is sexual feelings, which includes creativity and inspiration, the kind of motivational drive, desire. In a corporate setting, I usually call it desire. And that one would be really interesting to explore too. And I realized that that's probably one of my core modes when I go down to journal, is just that into that creative space. What does my creativity want? What am I desiring right now?
Yeah, I love that.
So
I love that model as well. I think maybe for me, that creative, sexual, kind of generative place, it's often a through line for all of it. For me, it can include all of the others. And so I think,
I love that.
There's a way in which it's really probably more of an individual kind of choice of making meaning about what your core emotions are. I think fundamentally for me, this exercise of distilling them, the importance of this is that human emotions are so complicated that if we force ourselves into an oversimplification, it really, it makes us get clear on what we're feeling in the moment, and helps us clarify the truth of what's moving through our being or our bodies or our minds in that moment. So
each of our emotions has like such an intelligence to it. Every emotion has its own unique wisdom or its own thing it's trying to tell us. For anger, it's like something is not serving me, something is not serving my people. For joy, there's something here to be celebrated. For sadness, there's something that's been lost. And often, I feel like we walk around with a base level of sadness that we haven't wanted to resolve. We haven't wanted to dig into or experience, especially in our, very pro positivity culture. Many of us have not touched our sadness. And sadness is just saying something's been lost. What's been lost is such a great question to ask when sadness is here. I love this exercise.
Yeah, I mean, for me, my sadness is a symbol of what I love. Honoring my grief is a way of honoring what I love.
Yeah.
And there's something really powerful about, the longing for that's tied up in grief and sadness. And longing for me is a clue into what I really care about. Right? So
yeah, beautiful. Another way that I know I've learned a lot about my shadow is in relationship and in community, and specifically in kinds of relationship where there's a lot of trust and safety, and where we have some implicit or explicit agreements about I care about you so much, I'm going to give you feedback. I know that I've learned a lot by working with you about that. Has that been your experience?
Oh, absolutely.
As well?
Yeah, I think this is the thing. What I found for myself is I I grow best through challenge,
Mm-hmm.
and others grow. And some of this may be kind of in the realm of like masculine, feminine, or just personality differences. My rapid growth always happens through getting called out on how I'm not showing up fully, and so having someone like you and some of our colleagues in relationship and having the opportunity to be called out for ways that we're maybe not showing up in our best is super powerful. So I've always been grateful. I mean, you gave me a couple of doozies lately around.
You're welcome.
Gave me one around. I think you called it a bit of like, well, it's just playing small in a certain way around finances and like hanging on a little too tight. And it's really allowed me to kind of look at how trusting am I that my work will be received in the world and that the world will continue to provide. I think there's a way in which you really called me out on that. You've also called me out many times on my aloofness and my seeming arrogance, which I'm always grateful for that, even though I've been hearing that for 25 years. But to hear it from you is like, oh, I guess I still haven't sorted that one out yet.
And it's such a good example to illustrate, what it means to challenge someone, and that word, like, Luke and I use that in a very, very specific sense, which is, I see something in you that you're not letting through. I see a gift in you. There's something lovable in there that you're not giving and you're not letting be seen, and you're not loving it enough. So like, I stand for you letting that gift through. I stand for you loving that part of you that I love. So when these are good examples because I can challenge you on your playing small, because when I look at you, I see just a rock star, superstar. And the world sees you that way too. And so when I see these little niggles, I just want to be like, Luke, you are amazing. And so it's safe. We're allowed to do that with people that we love. We're allowed to do that when we have a sense that there's more that could be shared. There's more that could be allowed. There's more that could be free. We're allowed to do this with our friends, our colleagues, our family. But it's because we have that two-way relationship where you do it for me, I do it for you. I mean, I can't even, the last time we did some significant shadow work, I actually literally don't remember what we were talking about in terms of the content. I just remember looking up with smiling and also crying, of just this sense of relief of like, I'm okay. It's okay for me to have this part. Like, it's okay for me to be this way. And I got completely disoriented, and I think I was supposed to kind of go back to my place in the circle, but I was just so like lost in the moment. And then I remember you saying, you can sit down now.
Yeah.
It was a powerful moment.
Yeah. I think my belief is what you're describing, this kind of thing that we help each other with. This is also probably the most valuable thing that I give my clients. And I'm guessing that you give yours is like when we've actually been working with them long enough to see where they're either playing small or holding themselves back or hurting themselves or others, and they're not fully getting it, for us to actually compassionately give them that challenge is, in my experience, probably the most important thing that I do in my work in the world. So
yeah, amen. Luke, is there anything that those listeners who are really, really interested, and we have some listeners that are very committed to going deep on personal growth, is there anything that you're offering soon that they could become a part of? Any programs or retreats that you're leading?
Yeah, I teach a very specific model around shadow work called shadow work seminars, and we regularly do weekend retreats where we each person that comes has an opportunity to be facilitated by me and one of my partners in doing some of this parts work that I described. And I've got one coming up. I think the next one is January 17th in the Bay Area in San Francisco.
Oh, great.
Just north of San Francisco. And so if people are interested in that, they can register at the website evolution.team under the events tab. They'll find that event and several other events.
Great.
And
so
then
January 17th, Shadow Work Seminar. Awesome.
17th through the 19th. It's a Friday through Sunday, Friday night through Sunday afternoon. And there's limited spots. We'll usually have about 12 to 15 people. And it's an opportunity to really do a deep piece of work around owning your specific shadow and in shifting your relationship to a specific shadow.
Sounds really powerful.
Yeah.
What if people want to get in touch with you and do some one-on-one work or follow some of the things that you're teaching?
Yeah. So they can visit my website, lukeentrup.com, or can also find me at evolution.team. Yeah, I do one-on-one coaching. I'm also launching this year, I'm launching a men's leadership group. So working specifically with men around how to work with a deeper sense of purpose in their work in the world and in their relationships. So that's launching a little later in 2020 in March.
Awesome. So lukeentrup.com, and we'll have all of these links for you listeners on the show notes, and some resources as well that you can put to use right away. And the URL, of course, for our show notes is at caneel.com/podcast, and you can find all of this and more there. Well, Luke, it has been an amazing conversation. Every time I'm with you, I learn something new, and I feel a little part of me gets changed.
Yeah, thank you, Caneel. Likewise.
Thank you so much for being here today and getting to explore a topic that I believe will be really illuminating for you and is a core concept to personal development and growth, and truly mending your relationship with yourself, which is the foundation of all other relationships that you have. So really thank yourself for taking the time to be here. And next week, we have an episode for Thanksgiving on gratitude versus entitlement. I'm really looking forward to that one. I can't wait for you to be here for it. It's going to be airing on Tuesday, so make the time during your drive down to Grandma's, and I will see you then.
Aloud.
For more information, check out my website, caneel.com/podcast, CANEEL. Caneel.com/podcast, where you can find tons of resources, new episodes, show notes, transcripts, videos, all that good stuff to deepen your learning experience. Also follow me on social, Caneel.is on Instagram and @Caneel on Twitter.
Aloud.
You are allowed to be whole.